The US tried 3 different strategies against Iran. All 3 failed. Here's the proof. In Washington, there's a habit of describing military failures in strategic terms. A withdrawal becomes a realignment. A surrender, on the other hand, becomes a framework. And right now, this is exactly what happened in the agreement the US just signed with Iran. So, looking beyond this language designed to obscure the facts, let's take a look at the sequence of events that actually took place. The US had tried using air power for 40 days. Unfortunately, it failed to achieve its objectives. Then it imposed a naval blockade for about 2 months. It failed at that, too. And then it signed an agreement granting Iran virtually everything it wanted on the most contentious issue of the entire conflict. 3 instruments of American power. 3 failures. And there is a 4th outcome that no one in Washington wants to call by its real name. Stay with me, because its implications for Iran's nuclear program and for how Beijing interprets all of this are far more serious than the headlines suggest. Before you start, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. I'll start with an uncomfortable topic, because honest thinking usually has to begin here. Among those who comment on US foreign policy, there is a deeply ingrained habit of framing military failures as temporary setbacks. A ceasefire is called a pause. A failed blockade is called regaining strength and launching an attack. A signed agreement that concedes nearly everything is earnestly described as the first step toward a negotiated framework. In Washington, words go a long way. They cover up the cracks. And when those cracks turn into chasms, the language simply becomes even more flowery. What we are watching unfold in the Persian Gulf right now is not a pause. It is not a recalibration. And it is certainly not, in any meaningful sense of the word, a triumph. What it is, I think, is the latest chapter in a very long story about what happens when the most powerful military nation in history convinces itself that military power alone can solve political problems. So let us think through what has happened, step by step, without the comforting language. The war, let us be honest and call it a war, began in the last days of February. For roughly 40 days, from the end of February through the first week of April, the United States conducted a sustained air campaign against Iranian military infrastructure. This was a full air campaign, not a handful of strikes. And when it ended in early April, the question everyone should have been asking was simple. Did it compel Iranian capitulation? Did it destroy the nuclear program? Did it fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Gulf? The answer to all of those questions is no. And we know this not because someone said so in a press release, but because of what happened next. On April 13th, the United States shifted from air power to naval power. It implemented a blockade. That blockade lasted roughly 2 months, from mid-April to the 17th of June. A blockade is not a minor escalation. It is one of the most serious instruments of pressure a state can apply short of direct military occupation. And what happened on June 17th? President Trump signed what can only be described without illusion as a memorandum of understanding that concedes the core Iranian position. Now, you can argue, and the hawks in Washington are arguing it loudly, that this is not a concession, that leverage still exists, that Iran's economy is crumbling, that time is on Washington's side. To all of that, I want to say, look at the logic. If the air campaign had worked, there would have been no need for a blockade. If the blockade had worked, there would have been no need for the memorandum of understanding. The sequence itself tells the story. 3 major instruments of coercive pressure, air power, naval power, and economic strangulation through sanctions, were deployed in succession. After each one failed to produce capitulation, the United States moved to the next. After the third, it sat down and signed a deal on terms far closer to Tehran's red lines than to Washington's original demands. This is a reading of the sequence of events, not an opinion. But here is where it gets genuinely interesting, because the people most loudly insisting that America still has leverage, that Tehran is on its heels, are not stupid people. They are educated, well-connected, deeply immersed in Gulf security. So why do they keep saying things the facts seem to contradict? Part of the answer is ideological. There is a wing of American foreign policy thinking, not exclusive to either party, that is genuinely incapable of processing the idea that American military power has limits. The Iran experience, like Afghanistan and Iraq before it, is not just a policy failure to this group. It is an existential challenge to their entire framework. And existential challenges tend to produce denial rather than revision. The other part of the answer is structural. Washington's foreign policy establishment, the think tanks, the retired generals on corporate boards, the senators, the journalists who cover them, is heavily invested in the maintenance of American military primacy. When you ask that ecosystem to accept that a war was lost, you are not just asking for a factual concession. You are asking people to acknowledge that the thing they spent their careers building has failed. So when you hear voices insisting Tehran must dismantle its ballistic missile program, that militia proxies must be destroyed, that freedom of navigation must be guaranteed on American terms, what you are hearing is not a strategy. It is a wish list. And a wish list dressed up as a strategy is how countries end up in serious trouble. Let's talk about the Strait of Hormuz directly, because this is where the immediate standoff is happening, and because it illustrates something important. The strait is one of the most critical choke points in the global energy system. Close to a fifth of the world's oil passes through it. The Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, are utterly dependent on it for export revenues. China, Japan, and South Korea depend on it for energy supply. If you can credibly threaten shipping through the strait, you hold a lever affecting the entire architecture of global trade. Iran sits on both sides of the strait. It has spent decades developing the asymmetric military capacity to exploit that geography. Mines, anti-ship missiles, fast attack boats, drones. None of these are glamorous, but they make the strait an extremely dangerous place for anyone who wants to contest Iranian influence there. What we've seen in recent days is a continuation of the negotiating dynamic since the ceasefire was signed. The Iranians are making a point. The strait operates on our terms now. Commercial shipping that wants safe passage will come to us. That era of assumed American guaranteed open access is over. The American response strikes on Iranian positions in and around the strait, to which Tehran responded with ballistic missiles aimed at American installations in Kuwait and Bahrain, is not by itself a sign of catastrophic escalation. Both sides have been through a version of this before. In the days before the June MOU, there was a similar round of tit for tat. An asset hit, a response, another response, And then within days, both sides were sitting across a table working out terms. What is genuinely new, and what the commentary class has been slow to process, is the underlying structural reality that makes all of this possible. Iran did not win this confrontation through luck or accident. It won through a sustained, sophisticated, long-term strategy of asymmetric deterrence. The Iranians looked at the American military and asked a simple question: where is this machine vulnerable? The answer they found, over many years, was that it needs vast quantities of expensive precision munitions to sustain an air campaign. Its Gulf basing infrastructure is concentrated in a small number of fixed locations, and its political leadership is ultimately accountable to a domestic electorate tired of open-ended Middle East commitments. Iran did not need to defeat the American military conventionally. It simply needed to make the cost of continuing high enough, and the prospects of achieving American objectives uncertain enough, that the political calculus in Washington would eventually tip toward negotiation. And that is exactly what happened. Now let me address the nuclear question, because it matters more than most of the immediate tactical commentary. The nuclear program was, in the view of many serious analysts, the principal reason the United States ultimately chose to go to war against Iran. The logic was, Iran is approaching a nuclear threshold, and once it crosses that threshold, the entire strategic picture in the Middle East changes permanently. Israel becomes existentially vulnerable in a new way. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt begin to seriously consider their own nuclear options. Better to act now, with air power, while Iran is still a threshold state. The problem with that logic was not that it was irrational. The problem is that the air campaign failed to permanently destroy the nuclear program. Underground facilities survive air campaigns better than above-ground ones, and the Iranians had anticipated this scenario for years, dispersing and hardening their key installations accordingly. So the program was degraded, but not destroyed. And Iran's motivation to push it to completion, to cross the threshold, to make itself immune to this kind of attack in the future, is now stronger than it has ever been. That is the paradox at the heart of the American strategy. The attempt to prevent Iran from going nuclear has given Iran every conceivable incentive to go nuclear as quickly as possible. This is what makes the next phase of negotiations genuinely difficult, because the Iranians will come to that table holding the nuclear card, not a rhetorical one, an actual one. They will have demonstrated they can absorb extraordinary punishment rather than capitulate. And they will know, because the American side has already shown it knows, that there is no good military option remaining on the table. The air power option failed. The blockade failed. A ground invasion has never been seriously discussed. The logistics alone would be staggering, and the political cost in American domestic life would be terminal for whichever administration attempted it. So the United States will be negotiating from a position in which it has already conceded sovereign control of the strait, and must now find some way to limit Iranian nuclear development without a credible military threat to back up that demand. The hawks demanding that Washington hold firm are essentially demanding the impossible. You cannot credibly threaten military action you have already demonstrated you cannot sustain. Tehran knows it. I want to draw out a broader point here, because this conflict is also a symptom of something larger happening in the structure of international politics. For roughly 30 years, from the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 to around 2017, the United States operated in a genuinely unipolar world, not merely the most powerful country, but the only great power in a structural sense. Washington could pursue an extraordinarily ambitious vision of global order with a confidence that, in retrospect, was not always warranted, but was at least grounded in a real structural reality. That world is gone. We live in a multipolar world now. China is a genuine great power with global reach and ambitions. Russia, whatever its military limitations in Ukraine, remains a nuclear state with significant influence over European security. Regional powers, Iran, Turkey, India, Saudi Arabia, have developed the capacity to resist external pressure in ways they could not 2 decades ago. The United States has to operate in this environment without the structural advantages it once enjoyed. This has implications well beyond the Persian Gulf. The most consequential theater for the US-China competition is East Asia. Taiwan, the South China Sea, Japan, South Korea, Australia. These are the stakes that, in any rational prioritization of American interests, should command primary attention and resources. And here is the problem the Iran war has created for that prioritization. The United States deployed significant military assets to the Gulf campaign, exhausted, by some accounts, a significant portion of its precision munitions stockpile, moved air defense systems from Japan and South Korea to the Middle East, and repositioned naval assets that had been part of the Pacific deterrence architecture, all while China was watching very carefully to understand what American capacity and political will actually looked like under pressure. What did China observe? That the United States could not sustain a 40-day air campaign against a regional power to the point of achieving its stated objectives. That American base infrastructure in the Gulf, supposedly hardened, was vulnerable enough to Iranian ballistic missiles that personnel had to be evacuated into civilian hotels. That political will was limited by domestic economic pressure, fear of global energy disruption, and the simple exhaustion of a country at war for most of the past quarter century. None of that is encouraging for deterrence in East Asia. If you're sitting in Beijing thinking about Taiwan, you are not concluding that American military power is invincible and should not be tested. This creates a genuinely difficult situation for American strategists serious about the China challenge. On one hand, there is now a strong argument, probably the strongest it has ever been, for a fundamental reorientation away from the Middle East and toward the Pacific. On the other hand, the Iran experience has consumed resources, political capital, and munitions that would have been useful in any future East Asia contingency. The reorientation, when it comes, happens from a weaker position than if the war had never been fought. There's an analogy worth sitting with. After the fall of Saigon in 1979, after it became undeniably clear the American project in Vietnam had failed, the United States turned away from Southeast Asia entirely. For roughly a decade, strategic attention shifted with remarkable intensity to Europe, to NATO, to the nuclear balance. The Middle East became the next focal point after that, starting with the Iranian Revolution in 1979. There is a strong case something similar happens now. The last thing any American administration wants in the years after this war is to fight another war in the Persian Gulf. East Asia, China, Taiwan will become the place attention concentrates, partly from genuine strategic logic, and partly from the need to find a theater where American power can be reasserted after what has happened in the Gulf. Whether that will be healthy for American strategic culture is a separate question, because one of the lessons that should come out of this experience is about the limits of what military power can accomplish. The hawkish tradition has always operated on the assumption that the military, properly deployed and resourced, is a reliable instrument for achieving political objectives. Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Iran suggest that assumption needs serious revision. Not because the American military is not extraordinarily capable. It is. But military capability and political outcome are not the same thing. You can destroy infrastructure and degrade an adversary's military capacity. You cannot, by bombing alone, change what a people are willing to endure in defense of their sovereignty and survival. Iran fought this conflict with the memory of the 1980s close at hand. 8 years of war with Iraq, fought with chemical weapons, fought with external support for the other side, fought with staggering casualties. And Iran survived. It was economically devastated, but it survived. And the lesson its leadership drew from that experience was that survival requires making any adversary's cost of conflict high enough to be unbearable. That is what they built. That is what they deployed. And it worked. Let me say something about the domestic American dimension, because it matters enormously for what comes next. The critics of this agreement, the senators who are furious, the former officials writing op-eds, the commentators demanding Trump hold the line, are not wrong that the terms are deeply unfavorable to American stated objectives, or that a nuclear-capable Iran will be more dangerous in certain respects. All of that is true. What they are wrong about is the alternative. They speak about leverage as though it exists in the abstract, independent of what has already happened. They speak about getting tough, as though toughness is a strategy rather than a disposition. But strategy requires means, and the means that were available, air power, naval power, economic pressure, have been tried and have not produced the results that would allow Washington to dictate terms. You cannot maintain a negotiation position on the basis of threats your adversary has already tested and found limited. The more serious question, and one very few people in Washington are asking openly, is whether the goals themselves were ever achievable. Whether the combination of objectives American policy set for Iran, no nuclear program, no missile program, no proxies, full freedom of navigation on American terms, was ever realistically attainable short of regime change. If those goals were never realistically attainable, the failure is not simply one of execution, it is one of conception. That is a much harder thing to admit, because it implicates not just the current administration, but a bipartisan foreign policy consensus decades in the making. I will end on the financial dimension of all of this, because it is underweighted in most commentary. The United States is running annual deficits of roughly $2 trillion. Total debt is approaching, and by some measures has already reached, 100% of GDP. It spends approximately $1 trillion a year on interest payments alone. These are not numbers that can be indefinitely sustained. Combine that with an aging population, an expanding entitlement burden, and a defense industrial base that discovered in this war that it could not maintain the pace of precision munitions production a major air campaign requires, and you have a structural fiscal constraint on American foreign policy that is only going to tighten. The post-war settlement, in which the United States subsidized the security of Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, maintaining a global military presence no other country has ever matched, was affordable when America produced roughly half of global GDP. It is far less affordable at a quarter. Continuing to play global policeman amid fiscal stress, military overextension, and political exhaustion is precisely the kind of strategy historians of empire recognize as the precursor to accelerated decline. None of this is comfortable to say or hear, but clear thinking about American foreign policy, about what it can realistically achieve, about what is genuinely in the national interest versus what is the product of habit, ideology, and institutional inertia, requires first saying plainly what has happened and what it means. What has happened is that the United States went to war against Iran with maximum objectives. It has ended up negotiating an agreement that represents a significant step toward Iranian regional primacy. The Strait of Hormuz will now operate under conditions Iran substantially controls. The nuclear program, the reason many believe this war was started, remains and will likely accelerate. And the American military position in the Gulf has been demonstrated to be far more vulnerable than its advocates claimed. What it means is that the era in which American military power could simply overawe regional adversaries into compliance is over. Not because America is weak in any absolute sense, but because the world has changed, the adversaries have learned, and the domestic foundations of sustained military intervention have eroded in ways no administration's rhetoric can fully reverse. The question now is not whether to accept that reality. The question is whether to accept it clearly and build a foreign policy on that clear foundation, or to go on insisting, as empires in retrenchment always have, that the losses are temporary. The leverage is real, and the next escalation will finally produce the outcome the previous ones did not. History tends to be unkind to the second choice, and the people who pay for that choice are rarely the ones who made it. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from, and tell us what you think comes next. Whether Washington is capable of the structural rethinking this moment demands, or whether the same pattern simply repeats in the next theater. If you're not subscribed yet, this is the moment. Hit the bell, because the consequences of what we've just covered are going to play out for years, and we will be here covering every stage of it.